Hello and welcome. It is one of those auspicious days again where we get a Victoria 3 developer diary. This time we're going to be talking about capacities. Now, I can already see the argument brewing in that capacities is just Victoria 3's mana. It has been stated that Victoria 3 will not have mana, so we're going to have a look at what capacities are, and we'll make a judgment call then when we know what it is on whether it would constitute mana or not. Maybe at a future time, probably not in this video, we'll have a chat about what I actually think mana is, because it's not very well defined. But first, before we get into the dev diary, there was a video put out a couple of days ago on the 1st of June that was very, very interesting. Usually the videos that are put out around the dev diaries, explaining the things that are in them, kind of what I do, but usually they don't have new information, right? There's usually very little of that. However, this is kind of interesting because there is new information, and that's new, and that's change, and that's different. So we're gonna have a look at those, well, certain clips from that, have a chat about, you know, those interesting clips. Of course, there will be a link to the full video in the description below, so you can peruse at your leisure. But yeah, I think let's have a look at some of those clips first, shall we? So first off, we got our lovely Martin here.
When it comes to the player goals, and, you know, what is the aim of a campaign? What are you trying to do? I think this is also where the society building aspects of Victoria really shines through. Because in a lot of games, the goal is more like, I want to take over this territory, I want to restore this empire. But it can be very different than inward focused games, because instead it can be about, I just want to take this country and I want its people to have a good life. You don't have to have a grand ambition to go first. You can. We always want that. But it can be just as satisfying to just take what's there and build something, build your own little piece of the world just as you want it.
So, that is super interesting. I think this definitely feeds back into what we've heard before, that Victoria 3 is not a war game. And we'll get into some external parts about that first in a bit. But first, I just want to go over what you said there. You can certainly have the goal of, I want to make this country that I'm in control of good for my people to have a good as good a life as they possibly can. And that's super interesting. That's not something we have in any other Paradox game. There is a blog post, relatively famous at this point, by a historian by the name of Brett begins with a D. I'm blanking on the name, I so apologize. And it's basically talking about why EU4 is a bad simulation. I will find his name, and I'll also find his blog post, and I'll put it in the description below. But a big part of what I took out of that is that, you know, he's talking about why EU4 is not a good historical simulation, because it only simulates, or tries to simulate, or not really simulate, but, you know, whatever. The state, right? Everything that you do in the game is revolving around the state. And anything that the state does that gives the state more power is a good thing. And it is a bad simulation because it completely ignores the people that live in the country. Now, of course, EU4 does not have pops, so you can't really tell what is happening to the people. But he brings up things like culture conversion doesn't give any kind of unrest. It doesn't lower the development of a place. It takes, bird mana instead of military mana, which is interesting. It's basically genocide, let's be honest. But he brings up the point that the game doesn't care about your people, and you playing the game don't care about the people in your country. This is super interesting from Victoria 3, because you can have a game where your stated aim and goal is to make a country that is good for your people. And that's awesome! That's such an interesting idea, and I want to see that really pushed forward, because, you know, That's a new way to play a Paradox game. That's not something that any Paradox game has done at all well, if it has even been attempted. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second is I want to kind of expand on the idea that, Victoria 3 is not a war game, by pointing out that you probably still can go to war, right? And by probably, I mean you can still go to war. The idea that Victoria 3 won't let you control your armies, like literally every other Paradox game that I know of, has kind of caught on recently. And whether it was spurred on by One Proud Bavarian's video or not, I'm not sure. But I don't understand this idea that we're not going to be able to command troops, or that why we wouldn't want to. So I mentioned One Proud Bavarian a little while ago. Let me go over what I mean by that. He put out a video where he had a crackpot theory, in his own words, that instead of being in command of troops and having to, micro your cohorts or your brigades or armies or whatever, instead you would have something akin to the Hearts of Iron 4 air deployment region thing, where you would just deploy a nebulous amount of troops into a region, or maybe you'd put it under a commander and give him an aim in this region, and then the game would tell you how your armies had fared. And he felt confident that that was both going to be the case and that it was going to be fun. I disagree on both counts, because I think it is both not going to happen. I don't think Paradox would be willing to take out half of their game, and also I think that would not be remotely interesting or engaging or fun at all. Yes, Paradox has stated that Victoria 3 is not a war game. That does not mean that you won't be able to go to war. That does not mean you won't be able to command troops and do your standard warfare that you have in every other Paradox game, especially considering Victoria 2 has some bloody excellent warfare. Like, it's really bloody excellent. And I don't see Paradox wanting to sacrifice that. Making the rest of the game, making the peacetime side of the game really good such that you don't have to go to war is not the same as there ain't gonna be war as you know it. Right? It just isn't gonna be the case. And I'm as confident as he is that you're not going to have your standard war. I'm equally confident that he's wrong. I'm both confident that he's wrong, and I really bloody hope he's wrong. But yeah, that's my idea on, Paradox is saying that, there's not going to be any war in Vicky 3. It's bullshit. It's not. All right, you're going to have war. You're going to be able to move troops. It's like a 99.999% certain on that. Let's be fair. Anyway, moving on. Next clip.
Like the need for luxuries or the need for staple goods. And the goods that they choose is often based on what is most available in their market and what is cheapest. But in some cases, entire cultures can become fascinated with certain goods over other goods. So their need for luxurious exotic drinks might favor tea instead of coffee. If you don't provide it to them, they're going to get very upset. Their wealth is going to drop, there's going to be more radicals, and you're going to have to deal with that.
Also, another really interesting thing there, the idea of cultural fascination with certain trade goods. Now, I find this fascinating for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we've heard already in the Vikinomics panel about the British being really fascinated with tea. And that makes a hell of a lot of sense, considering that, as we heard in that panel, like 30% of the revenue that the Crown earned was through the tariffs on tea imports. As well, as stated by Wiz in this reply here, the British tea craze indirectly led to the Opium Wars. Because, and I personally can't really go super in-depth, but I can sort of explain this if you are unaware. tea from that the British had to drink came from trade with China. We got our tea from China, and we bought it, and we brought it back to Britain to consume. However, we weren't able to sell anything to the Chinese, right? The Chinese, firstly, thought that they were the center of the world, and that every possible good that they could ever possibly need for any of their possible people in their entire country could be found within the borders of China already. Obviously, this is kind of, short-sighted, isolationist bullshit. But that's what they believed. So the trading that went on with China was entirely one-directional, right? They would sell shit, they would not buy shit. So the British tried for a very long time to find some goods to sell to the Chinese, and eventually we found that there's a little bit of a thing that they liked, a bit of opium. It's kind of people kind of liked opium. Opium had always been in China, but it was a luxury item, right? It was a luxury item that had, it was just the upper classes people that really, consumed it. But what the British were able to do is bring in vast quantities of opium that they grew in India, Bengal, Burma, etc., and sell it into China through corrupt Chinese trading officials. Make a vast profit. And when I say the British, it was the East India Trading Company. And really, equalize the deficit. And that really led to the Opium Wars, as the Chinese tried to crack down on it, and then the British kind of had to back up their trade company. And force them to, give us Hong Kong. And then the Second Opium War, I think we got a little bit more of the island of Hong Kong. And just, went from there. So, yeah. British tea craze, the need to equalize the books to sell as much as we bought. So it was less about, just pumping money into China and more about, giving goods for goods is what led to the Opium Wars. And that is, that's interesting. Tea is bloody important. It's still important. But yeah, cultural fascination with goods is super duper interesting. There's another idea on this that I think really should be explored. And that is cultural fascinations with goods should go the other way as well. Maybe a cultural fascination with a good is more a case of a slider, where the British fascination or desire for tea is plus 50%. Numbers taken out my ass, of course. But what if it went the opposite way as well? What if, for example, Hindu pops in India had a negative 50% desire for meat, for cattle? Because for religious reasons or cultural reasons or whatever, Hindus don't eat as much meat as other countries, as other cultures. A large portion of Indians today are either vegan or vegetarian because that's the culture. So maybe we could have it be a two-way street. Maybe Americans are, they have a cultural fascination for coffee and a negative cultural fascination for tea because, the American fascination for coffee that lives on today kind of started as spite towards the British. We'll drink coffee instead of tea because tea is a British thing and we want to very much distance ourselves from Britain. And it's also the reason why they spell favour and flavour and colour and fence and offence and centre and a bunch of other words. It's why they spell them wrong, because of the desire to distance themselves from Britain. So maybe it could be that way with trade goods as well. Maybe the Americans would have a political fascination with coffee over tea. Maybe that could be extended elsewhere as well. Maybe these fascinations stemming from political events could be more of a thing. Who knows? That could be really interesting. Can opium be a fascination for the Chinese? Because, the aforementioned Opium Wars. Can fascinations have negative effects? Can trade goods have negative effects? these are all interesting questions I really hope are answered in the future. I would absolutely love to see. But before I just ramble on forever about tea and opium, let's have a look at the third clip.
One thing with Victoria 3 that has been a very stated design goal from the start is that we are not making a war game. We are not making a map painter. We are making a game where war takes a little bit of the back seat. That is not to say that war isn't in the game, of course. It's a historical simulation of the 19th century, and the 19th century was not, unfortunately, entirely peaceful. So war, of course, happens. It can be a way to get things you want, but anything you can get through war, you can also get through diplomacy.
Ideally, you should...
There you go. Anything you can get through warfare, you can get through diplomacy, and warfare is in the game. It's confirmed yet again. Victoria 3 warfare confirmed. I just wanted to add that clip in just to really hammer home the point that, you know, you're gonna see war, and it's not gonna be boring like one pro Bavarian once. I love the guy, but I mean, come on. I'm sorry, but no. This part here is also fun, so I will unpause and you can listen to this a little bit as well.
Want to try to solve this.
You can also get through diplomacy.
Yeah. Ideally, you should want to try to solve this conflict before it escalates into war.
Ideally, you would want to solve the conflict before it leads to war. Basically stating that peace is desirable. Peace is a better option than warfare.
If it does escalate into war, maybe that'll work out well for you, but a lot of your people are going to die one way or another. It's always best to try to avoid it, if possible.
Always best to try and avoid warfare if possible is super interesting. That is not the case in any other Paradox game. There's no other Paradox game where it is better to avoid war. Even if you win a war in Vicky 3, your pops are still going to die. You are still going to have casualties. Unless you can, you know, I've had it be the case in Vicky 2 where I rock up with an army in on its fleet and they've just rocked up outside the nation and then they surrender. However, that I would say is still part of the diplomacy and you know, fronting side of things. But yeah, if you go to war, you're gonna have casualties, and that is not gonna be good for you. If you can get it through peace, that's obviously better. So, I mean, again, I just wanted to really hammer home the point of it's really interesting what they're doing when it comes to peacetime gameplay and warfare, because, you know, in other games, if you could get something by peace, sure, that's fine. But at the same time, you're missing out on fun gameplay and peacetime gameplay in other Paradox titles, with maybe the exception of like Stellaris and Imperator Rome. There's not much to do when you're at peace. Your gameplay options are relatively limited there. And it's really fascinating to see them really push home the peacetime populism? No, that's a terrible way of putting things. You know, the peacetime focus of the game is really, really interesting to see.
The 19th century is also a fantastic era for alternative history because there is so much potential for things to have played out differently, but also because it's the era that shaped our era. I think it's really exciting to get the sense of being able to look into the future of your campaign and imagine a different world right here and right now.
Again, I just wanted to point out just the idea of alternate history is a powerful one in Paradox games. It's kind of the only part of the Paradox game that makes sense. As soon as you unpause the game, it is alternate history, of course. But just the idea that they're pointing this out is making me think of the era that the game is set in. And yeah, there was, for example, World War I could have happened in so many different ways. The alliance situation in Europe was not some static thing before World War I broke out. There were alliances between the British, Italians, Spanish and Austrians. It was like the Mediterranean alliance. There was an alliance between Germany and Russia. There was an alliance between Germany, Italy, and Austria. There was an alliance between England and Germany. There was an alliance potentially between Germany, China, and America. There was an alliance between England and Japan. All these different alliance things were going on around the right time for a great war to break out, and it just happened. It was happenstance that it happened to be the alliance between, the Entente, Britain and France, versus the triple alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. That was the case when, war broke out, and also Russia getting involved as well, and then the Americans get involved as well, the Ottomans, and it was a whole thing. World War I was crazy. But I just want to point out, alliances weren't some static, immutable thing, and, any kind of alternate history is honestly perfectly reasonable to imagine, right? It's happenstance that we ended up with the world that we ended up with, that World War I happened in the way that it did. Any of the powers being on the other side is perfectly reasonable to imagine that would be the case. It's not like, oh, we're just changing the entire ethos of this one country to put it on the other side. That's not the case. There were perfectly good reasons for, say, Britain to be on the side of the Germans, or the French to be on the side of the Germans, or the Italians to be on the side of the... Look, the Italians were on both sides. It's bad example. But it's really interesting that is being brought up as well. All right, I have some more clips.
Victoria is and should be a deep game with a lot of mechanics and potential complexity, and that's not something we want to change. But we have prioritized accessibility, not in the sense of wanting to streamline or just make the game simpler, but build, the interface, the tools, and the information that the player needs to be able to grasp and understand and eventually, master all of this complexity.
Again, I keep saying again. That's my way of leading into what I want to say, apparently. There's been a lot of talk about, they're dumbing down the game. They're dumbing down the game. This is dumbing down the game. The game looks like a mobile game. Round buttons equals mobile game. Don't like the UI, that means mobile game. Bad game. Blah, 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 blah. There's been a whole shit ton of talk about that. And everything that I've seen from the game makes it look like there is more complexity. The pops seem more complex than the pops in Vicky 2, for example. I'm sure when we get to Warfare, it's going to be more complex than Vicky 2. Having accessibility as a stated aim, especially when the previous game in the franchise is as obtuse with accessibility as Victoria 2 is, ain't a fucking bad thing. Quit your bitching about game dumbing down, because you have no idea if that's going to be the case or not. You have no idea if that's going to be the case. All you've seen is some screenshots where things look accessible. Like menus look decent. Like the UI doesn't look like a pain in the arse to use. That's all you've seen so far. That doesn't mean the game is dumbed down. And you really, really need to hold on to your titties, basically. Hold on to them. Hold on to them.
So while you have people working in your textile mills, that doesn't just mean plus 15 luxury clothes, happiness goes up. No, what it means is that you produce some more luxury clothes. The people buying luxury clothes are the upper strata of your society. And their happiness doesn't just go up. What happens is the price of luxury clothes goes down, so their income will stretch higher. Their wealth will go up. They will gain more loyalists in their pop. That means their interest group will become happier and will support your laws more. So by expanding this textile mill, the knock-on effect is that now you might be able to pass a law without the landowners interfering.
Yeah, so about that complexity, does that seem more complex to you? The idea that if you build a textile mill, the knock-on effects could be political in nature, allowing you to pass laws. But yeah, no, dumbing down the game, guys. Dumbing down the game. Anyway, those are the clips that I wanted to show you. And I think they're some pretty good clips, and I think that you should probably enjoy them, and I will leave a link to this video in the description below for you to peruse at your own leisure. But for now, let us go on to the meat of today's video, even though we're already 25 minutes in, and let's talk about today's Dev Diary. Talking about capacities. Let's get into it. Hello! And welcome back to another Victoria 3 Dev Diary. Today we'll be talking about 3 of the 4 main currencies of the game, namely capacities, the last being money, which we'll of course come back to later. We mentioned in the very first Dev Diary that there is no mana in Victoria 3, and since this Dev Diary is about the game's currencies, I want to be clear on what I mean by that. When we say there is no mana, we mean that the resources in Victoria 3 arise and are spent in clearly defined ways that are parts of the simulation, not from an overly abstract concept or vague idea. There is of course some degree of abstraction involved, all games are abstractions after all, but we want all of the game's currencies to be strongly rooted in the mechanics and not feel arbitrary. But enough about that and on to capacities. What are they exactly? Well, for starters, calling them currencies is actually not accurate. Capacities are not pooled resource and are not accumulated or spent. Instead, they have a constant generation and a constant usage, similar to, for example, admin capacity in Stellaris. And you generally want to keep your usage from exceeding your generation. Each capacity represents one specific area of your nation's ability to govern and is used solely for matters relating to that area. As mentioned, capacities are not accumulated, so excess generation is not pooled, but instead there is an effect for each capacity, which is positive if generation exceeds usage, and quite negative if usage exceeds generation. A country that incorporates territories left and right without expanding its bureaucratic corpse, may quickly find itself mired in debt as tax collection collapses under the strain, which is especially kind of poignant considering that's kind of how the Ottomans were falling. They had a vast population that they struggled to tax well because their bureaucracy was so outdated and terrible. So they had the ability to be as powerful and not be the sick man of Europe, but they couldn't effectively administer their empire. And it collapsed under the strain. Bureaucracy represents a nation's ability to govern, invest in, and collect taxes from its incorporated territory. It is produced by the government administration building, where many of a nation's bureaucrats will be employed. All of a nation's incorporated states use a base amount of bureaucracy, which increases with the size of their population, and further increased by each institution, such as education or police, more on those later, that a country has invested in. Overall, the purpose of bureaucracy is to ensure that there is a cost to ruling over, taxing, and providing for your population. Administering China should not be cheap. I like this idea. You know, the cost of owning some area of land is not zero, right? Taking extra territory is not a zero-sum game like it is in, for example, EU4. Admin capacity really doesn't mean a whole bunch of shit there. For example, with the colonies that the British and the French specifically had in Africa, a lot of those colonies cost more to maintain than they got in return. And mostly was spurred on by Belgian and Italian attempts to, you know, get into Africa too. That is why, like, the scramble of Africa really happened. It was spurred on by others trying to take a piece of the pie that other great powers had been, you know, nibbling on for hundreds of years. And the reason why, you know, for hundreds of years, why didn't the Portuguese, when they first arrived in Africa in the late 1400s, why didn't they just take all of it when they had the ability? Because it costs more to maintain than you got from it in return. Of course, these powers did take from Africa. They took vast quantities, but they did not take as much as it cost them to hold on to them. I'm not trying to paint the great powers as like heuristic good. Like, that's not what I'm trying to say at all. I'm just saying that it did cost them a great deal of money to administer these regions. So, kind of representing that bureaucratic cost to having an area of land is very important, and I'm glad that they are really they're really showing that. I like that a lot. So we have here the Swedish bureaucracy. It's currently a bit overworked, and the country could certainly benefit from another government administration building or two. They got a negative 53 balance, which is causing 21 tax waste. They generate 250 bureaucracy, got base value, got administration in Svealand, but they use 303 due to incorporated states, the amount of pops in those states, the amount of law enforcement you have, the amount of education you have. Lovely. Authority represents the head of state's personal power and ability to enact change in the country through decree. It's generated from your laws. Generally, the more repressive and authoritarian the country, the more authority it will generate, and it is used by a variety of actions such as enacting decrees in specific states, interacting with interest groups, and promoting or banning certain types of goods. Overall, the purpose of authority is to create an interesting trade-off between more and less authoritarian societies. By shifting the distribution of power away from the pops into the hands of the ruler, your ability to rule by decree is increased, and vice versa. So again, looking at Sweden, the Swedish king has more authority at his disposal than he's currently using, slightly speeding up the rate at which laws can be passed, because of course we do know already that laws are not a click button, instantly get law, like they are in Victoria 2 with the reforms. It's not the case here. So we have 30% excess, giving 7.5% enactment rate, which is for the laws, of course. It is generated through, you have a base value, you have some because you're an oligarchy, some from national supremacy, some from freedom of conscience, right of assembly, and from ruler traits, experienced political operator. And then it is used because they are collecting consumption taxes on liquor, and there is road maintenance in Svealand and Götaland. Lovely stuff. Yeah, I can see this working. And I'm already convinced that this is not mana. I'm already convinced. I know that people are going to claim it is, but I'm convinced that it's not. And finally, we have influence. It represents a country's ability to conduct diplomacy and its reach on the global stage. It's generated primarily from your rank. Great powers have more influence than major powers, and so on, and is used to support ongoing diplomatic actions and pacts, such as improving relations, alliances, trade deals, subjects, and so on. Overall, the purpose of influence is to force players to make interesting choices about which foreign countries they want to build strong diplomatic relationships with. So again, we're using Sweden. It has plenty of unused influence and can certainly afford to support another diplomatic pact or two. We have plus 530. There's 100% more excess. So we have more threat decay. That is an interesting one. Threat is like your aggressive expansion in EU4 or your infamy in Victoria 2. Having a plus 50% to your decay means that if you have a shit ton of influence, spare influence that is, then you are going to be able to go to war more often. Which is very, very interesting. So we have a generation of 880, 100 base value. You have some from being a minor power. You would, I guess, have more if you're a major. 200 from the ruler trait, 10% from landowners' family ties. And then it is using 300 to improve relations with Prussia, and it has a personal union over Norway costing 50. So it looks like it's capped at 100%, because if it's gaining 880 and losing 350, then that is more than 100% more. So, yeah, capped at 100, sure. This is a pretty big enough bonus anyway. So, what do I think of this one? Perfectly reasonable. These, at first glance, do not look like mana, right? What I consider mana to be is a currency that accumulates over time. So if for example, we had authority here, we had an excess of 165. If we were banking 165 every day, week, month, whatever, and it was accumulating, so, the next year we would have, 330, and then the next year we'd have more, 495, then, yeah, sure, that would be mana. That would be mana completely, right? But that's not the case. You have this much of your resource, and you're using this much, but it doesn't change, it doesn't accumulate, you don't get extra again and again that you're dipping into, which I would consider mana. This is something that we haven't seen very much of in Paradox. Of course, they point out administrative capacity in Stellaris, and yeah, that's fairly close, I guess. You have a certain capacity you're using from that capacity. If you're under that capacity, you get bonuses. If you're over it, you get malices. That's not a mana. That's not a mana. So, from the looks of it, Victoria 3 does not have mana. Confirmed. And I'm very happy with that because, well, I don't like mana. Mana bad. Mana bad. So yeah, Victoria 3 does not have mana. Confirmed. Yeah, capacities. I'm happy with them. Considering around this time in Imperator Rome's development, we had the dev diary talking about mana. And also that the dev diary around this time for EU4 when it talked about mana. Having Victoria 3 have a dev diary this early talking about the closest thing they have to mana, and it very specifically and certainly not being mana, is really promising, and I am here for it. I am here for it. Good shit. No, I'm totally happy with this. That gets a like from me. But I would love to know what you guys think. I know this has been a very, very long video, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. If you would like to leave your thoughts and comments in the comment section below, please do so. I do read them all. If you'd like to keep up to date with all Victoria 3 news and updates, hit the subscribe button. If you would like to see more of this face, I stream on Twitch. There's a link in the description there where you can go and follow me. And I will definitely be seeing you in the next one, where there will be more Victoria 3 news. I hope to see you then. Bye-bye.